One is the all short essay. I usually like to grade them as soon as possible. This week is a little hectic in terms of administrative duties on my end. I have to submit the schedule for not only the upcoming summer but also the fall. So, and I was really prepared to submit the schedule for the summer, but then all of a sudden they tell me now you got to do the fall too. So, fun times. So long story short, my other duties have kind of required me to delay this. I will have your short essays graded by next week, okay, for sure. Definitely by the end of this coming weekend. All right, so I apologize for the delay. Aside from that, you all have an exam coming up. Exam number 2 will open on Friday at 9 a.m. and will close on Sunday. No, actually, it will actually open Friday like at 12 a.m. and will close on Sunday at 9. Please remember, please complete the exam before you actually, before the deadline. All right, make sure that you have it done sometime this coming weekend, all right, lest you aren't able to turn it in. I think that's about it in terms of, obviously you do have other assignments due this weekend as well. So next week we'll come back and we'll start with chapter number 5. But I wanted to keep in mind, or I'm sure that you all have noticed, that we're coming up on spring break in 2 weeks. Obviously, needless to say, you won't have class that week. And just to give you all a break, and because I'm so wise and benevolent, you all won't have assignments due that week. All right, there are no weekly assignments, so you all will get a break, at least from this class. So, you're welcome. All right, now, nevertheless, what I am going to do is, I'll be honest with you, I'm falling a little bit behind in terms of the lecture. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to post a video lecture that you'll watch at your own discretion. In other words, if you want to watch it sometime during the break, you're more than welcome to. But nonetheless, it will be a lecture that will be on not this coming exam, but the following exam. All right, so I would suggest sometime, during the break, that you sit down and watch it and take notes, because the material that's covered in that video lecture will be on the exam. Okay, and again, this is just mostly for me because I'm falling behind a little bit, so this is for me to be able to catch up when we come back from the break. Again, a reminder that we're going to have a shift after when we come back from the break. All right, starting on that Tuesday, which I believe is the 22nd. This group B, all right, starting that week will come on Thursdays. All right, Group A will start coming on Tuesdays. I apologize for the break, or for the confusion, but I need to make sure that the classes are rounded out. So, again, Group B, starting post-spring break, will start meeting on Thursdays. All right, Group A will start meeting on Tuesdays. All right? Any questions? And again, of course, I'll remind you all and all these other good things. Yes?
Just to make sure, this class is Thursday
after the break. Yeah, so today, obviously, next Tuesday, you all still meet as usual. After the break, you all meet here on Thursdays. Okay? Any other questions? And like I said, I'll remind you about the changes and all that other good stuff over the next couple of weeks. You're reminded and all that other good stuff. So again, just be aware over the next couple of weeks. So what I want to do today is finish up chapter 4 and get you all squared away for the exam coming up this weekend. I did post the study guide. Yes, I didn't just hallucinate that. Yeah, good. Okay, so. If y'all recall, we're talking about the early development of chattel slavery in what becomes the United States. Right? If y'all recall, originally the first colonists, particularly in Virginia, depended on indentured servants for the manual labor to work the tobacco plantations. However, because of Bacon's Rebellion, things changed. So starting from the first set of slaves arriving in the colonies in 1619, for the next 60 or so odd years, you begin to see a steady increasing number of slaves being imported from Africa. Now, here's the thing, is that with the beginnings of the slave society, planters began to enact laws to protect their power over the slaves. So here's the thing: is that when I say the word racism, right? Obviously, we have a very specific definition in mind. You know, it's prejudice against someone for their ethnicity or their background. But when I refer to racism here, I'm referring to what we call institutionalized racism. The actual process of creating laws and policies that essentially emphasize what we call today white supremacy. Right? Now, prior to, let's say, 1680, this institutional racism really doesn't exist in the colonies. Right? Yes, slavery does exist, but in terms of discrimination against even those who are free, whether because they're master freedom or because they bought their freedom or because they were born in a colony that does not recognize chattel slavery, you really don't have any laws against them. So you do have, in many instances, freed blacks owning property, managing property. You have, and again, very, very rare opportunity, but every once in a while you actually have a successful black farmer that even owns their own slaves. All right, so it's a very complicated, convoluted situation. However, starting around 1680, with this institutionalizing of slavery, you begin to see the actual policies making it, that make not only, you know, kind of you know, restrict the rights, the very few rights or liberties that slaves have, but also you begin to see them going after freed blacks in the form of unable to serve on juries, unable to sign contracts, et cetera, et cetera. So you begin to see this institutionalized racism starting around 1670, 1680 throughout the colonies. All right, and again, it becomes an issue of social division, all right, where all of a sudden now it's not just merely, race isn't just merely, you know, just a minor issue. All of a sudden, the issue of black inferiority, white supremacy becomes the focal point of these slave societies, especially in the South. It will continue to be so. You can make the argument even till today, right? Now, in the Carolinas, and not just in the Carolinas, but many areas, especially in the South, you begin to see Native Americans become actively involved in the process of slavery. Now, originally, all right, when these colonies were founded, they were more than willing to take in Native American slaves, and some particular entities, like the Creek tribe, would actually sell prisoners of war to Anglo settlers, right, to become slaves. Now, as the preference for Native American slavery ends, right, you see these Native Americans in Georgia and Carolina actually kind of serve as bounty hunters. For example, if you have an escaped slave from a plantation in Georgia, it is a pretty common practice that these plantation owners would go to the local Native American tribe who know the lay of the land, who know the best spots to hide, and employ them to hunt down this escaped slave. All right, so again, Native Americans, very active in this kind of whole slave society, not only being slaves themselves, but in some regard actually serving as providers of slaves in the form of headhunters and in the form of bounty hunters. Now, as I mentioned, the early colonies of Carolina and Georgia emphasized their economy on rice production. Rice becomes, again, up in this early colonial period, the main source of income for Carolina and Georgia. Now remember, much like sugar, much like tobacco, rice is a labor-intensive crop, which means that you begin to see this emphasis on slavery, on African slaves, again, originally Native American, but later African American slaves, all right, as this source of labor. Now, by 1770, the number of South Carolina slaves reached 75,000, right, which at the time is half of the state's population. So again, even on the eve of independence, right, South Carolina's population, nearly half of it was actual slaves. So this goes to show you just how quickly the slave economy has risen. Now, down in Georgia, Georgia was established by a group led by James Oglethorpe in 1773. Now, James Oglethorpe is an individual hoping to create I guess what you would call a utopia, a perfect society. So, this began by essentially banning liquor and slaves, but settlers eventually demanded the right for self-government and repealed the bans by the 1750s. So originally, this was done to try to create a good, faithful society, right, which banned slaves, banned alcohol, banned smoking, etc., etc. However, as more colonists who arrived in Georgia, they weren't interested in any of that, and so many of those laws banning slaves, banning alcohol, were quickly banned a few years later. Now, as I mentioned, because the economies of New England and the middle colonies were based on small farms, slavery was less important. Now, given that slaves were few and posed little threat to the white majority, laws were less harsh in the than in the South. Now, slaves did represent a large percentage of urban laborers, particularly in New York and Philadelphia. So, again, you begin to see very strict discriminatory laws, not only against slaves, but even freed blacks in colonies like the Carolinas and in Georgia. In the North, they're not as strict because the population of slaves is relatively small compared to what's going on in Virginia all the way down. All right, so nonetheless, all right, you do have slavery. For the most part, most of them serve as either labor in I guess if you would call blacksmith workshops, domestic servants, etc., etc. All right, you don't really see the plantation-style economy in the North because simply the northern climate does not allow for the growing of any type of cash crop like tobacco or rice. Now, you have to understand that the areas in which the majority of these slaves in Africa are being captured and before they're loaded onto these ships, it's an incredibly diverse area. All right, we're talking about a coastline, all right, that is roughly the size between what is now Miami, Florida, all the way up to what is now Prince Edward Island, California, in Canada. It's an incredibly large area. All right, so you have slaves speaking multiple languages, multiple cultural practices, backgrounds, etc., etc. And now they're being moved into these areas and being worked and being told to work alongside one another. All right, and so you have this very, very different societies and areas coming together during this period of time. Now, despite this, right, you do begin to see a somewhat sense of a culture forming during this period of time. Right, now, despite the difference in language, despite the difference in cultures, many of them shared a common semi-familiar religious background with another. Right? Many of the West African religions at this point in time emphasized the power of spirits, the power of I guess what you would call, as we discussed last week, witchcraft. There are some common elements in many of their religions, and so they began to take this. And starting in the 1700s, when many plantation owners began emphasizing the conversion to Christianity, many began kind of blending aspects of Christianity and their traditional African folklore religions into what we call a syncretic religion. Now, just an example, down in the Caribbean, right, particularly those islands dominated by the French and by the Spanish, you have, again, many slaves being forced to convert to Catholicism. So what you would see is this adoption of Catholicism and the blending of it with traditional African religions. Now today, this is still in existence to this day, this religious, what we call religious syncretism. All right, you might be aware of it. All right, it is colloquially known incorrectly, but nonetheless, as voodoo, aka Santeria. Contrary to popular belief, voodoo, Santeria is not devil worshiping. All right, quite frankly, it is Christianity. All right, however, it is blending traditions of I guess what you would call in traditional West African cultures with Catholicism. In other words, it is not uncommon for an individual. Like, I'll give you an example. For those of you who are familiar with your patron saints, does anyone know the patron saint of lost causes in Catholicism? Anyone? St. Jude. So let's say that you have a difficult task ahead of you, you're probably not going to succeed, or even if you lose your car keys for that matter, in Catholicism, it is not uncommon for someone to pray to St. Jude to help you find or solve an issue or get you through this. And so let's say, and so it is not uncommon in situations that an offering, that many of these practitioners in Santeria would provide an offering to St. Jude for this exact reason. Now this offering could be in the form of food, could be in the form of rum, could even be in the form of a sacrifice of a small chicken or a goat. All right, so the blending of these traditional African customs with Catholicism, and particularly in the British colonies, Protestantism is pretty common. Right? Now, in the Chesapeake region, the area of Virginia, Maryland, the tobacco plantations there, the slaves learned English and were exposed in many instances to white culture. Now, in the South, communities on rice plantations retain significant cultural elements. So, in the Chesapeake region, all right, you have this exposure to English culture, and you have them learning English, adopting English, and begin adapting certain white, English white customs. Now, in Georgia, you have a very, very different society for it. Georgia and the Carolinas, you have a much more segregated society between the slaves and the plantation owners, and so you have a very distinct African blend to these things, a blend to the culture that develops there. They had very little contact with the whites and enjoyed much more autonomy when compared to the slaves and other economies. And so the slaves working in these rice and indigo plantations in Georgia and in South Carolina were much more isolated, much more autonomous. Right? They weren't forced into Christianity. They weren't forced to learn English. Right? They, it's not to say that things were easier. That's literally the opposite of what I'm trying to imply. What I'm trying to say is that they were much more, retained much more of their traditional African sense of being, as opposed to, let's say, for example, the North or even in Virginia. Now, one of the questions that I often get in terms of slavery is, why weren't there resistance? Why wasn't there any type to escape or to resist or overthrow your masters, et cetera, et cetera? And I mean, it's one of those things where from the outside looking in, that seems like a logical question. But the thing about it is that it's one that is very difficult to answer. Let's say that you have a situation where a slave is taken from what is now Nigeria, all right, at 8 years old, and is brought to a rice plantation in Georgia, right, and decides, enough's enough, I am going to escape. Okay, where? Where are you going? Let's say that you have spent the last 10 years as a slave on this rice plantation, have never left, but now you're going to make a run for it. Where? Where can you possibly go? Do you know the lay of the land? Probably not. Or do you know any of the locals who can help you? Unlikely. So the reason why many slaves did escape this time is because there's no solution. There's no alternative, all right, to this. All right, and so this is why many slaves found it impossible to escape. And even then, the idea of a slave rebellion is one that is constantly on the minds of many plantation owners. And they go out of their way to try to avoid any type of even a discussion of a slave rebellion. All right, those same laws that I said really, really crack down on slaves in the South, there are laws in Carolina, in South Carolina, and in Georgia that prohibit the gathering of more than 3 slaves at a time. All right, why? Because they don't want to start talking. They don't want the plantation owners don't want the slaves to start talking about killing their masters or overthrowing them or whatever. Now, in many societies, in many parts of, like for example in Brazil, you actually do have organized. So what happens in places like in what is now Haiti and in Brazil, where slaves will escape and they know exactly where to go. Right? There are whole communities of thousands, tens of thousands of ex-slaves who escape. Like for example, in Haiti, right, there are hidden towns and villages within the dense tropical mountainous regions of Haiti, where you actually have communities forming. Right? These ex-slaves, Maroons, as they're known in French, basically live there and as escaped slaves. Right? And there are thousands, tens of thousands. So as escaped slaves, you have that. Now here in the colonies, you don't really have that. There are no escaped slave settlements. Right? And so it is very difficult for a slave to escape. Nonetheless, there are examples of slave rebellions. For example, in 1739, in South Carolina, a group of slaves led by an individual and a slave named Stono killed their masters, burned down several plantations, trying to escape to Florida. Florida at the time, or what is now Florida, was held by the Spanish, right, which had offered amnesty, or at least basically freedom, to any slave that came from Georgia. Right? And so this individual Stono, actually, he led a group of slaves down, attempting to march into Florida, all right, meanwhile burning down plantations and killing as many plantation owners as possible. Now eventually, over a possible war that broke out, the Spanish were forced to give Stono and his allies back to the colonists, where they were then tried and hung, all right, for attempting to, or leading this revolt. In 1741, in the city of New York, a conspiracy begins developing, or at least the rumor of a conspiracy begins developing. Basically what happens is, a series of fires broke out in the city that led many to suspect that this was actually a slave conspiracy, all right? That slaves had been conspiring with each other to burn down parts of the city to terrorize it. There is no evidence of whatsoever, but it didn't stop the local population from rounding up suspected slaves and part of this conspiracy and murdering them. All right, so you have again these incidents of either rebellions or even fears of rebellion that drive many individuals in the colonies here. All right, and again, this is the kind of the premise of many of these laws restricting the rights and well, even just the basic human decency of slaves out of fear of these rebellions. Now, aside from slaves, needless to say, which the law doesn't apply to them, the average English citizen expected protection under what we refer to as common law. Now, common law is the same system of legal system used for the most part here in the United States, right? And it's pretty much established as this. So common law basically refers to the laws that govern society and even go, everything from disputing contracts to real estate to even criminal procedures, things of this nature. All right, and so our law system that we use here in the United States is based on this, what we call English common law. Now, this is different from most of the non-English speaking parts of the world. For example, in Mexico, you have something known as, it is basically based on the Napoleonic Law Code. Now, the differences are there's some significant ones, but overall, at the end of the day, these basically refer to the rights of the accused. I'll give you an example. Here in the United States, all right, you are presumed to be innocent until proven guilty. Yes? All right, and even then, if you're found guilty by a jury of your peers, your punishment is determined by a judge who will use previous cases along the same line to determine your punishment. Right? In Napoleonic law, or what we call civil law codes, like it happens in Mexico, guilt is always presumed. So the situation in Mexico is that you are guilty until you're presumed innocent, or presumed guilty until you're proven innocent. So it's the reverse. And even then, the judges there are a lot more restrictive in terms of their ability. Let's say, for example, that you commit a crime that the law code says you got to serve 6 years for, you're going to serve 6 years for. All right, here it may be 3 to 5 with a year, that you could have, you may be able to serve a year with good behavior. In the civil law code countries, it doesn't happen that way. All right, if you commit a crime and the law said you got to serve 5 years or 6 years, you're serving 5% years. All right, so minor things here and there, but nonetheless, the common law system is what pretty much unites, not just colonists here, but even with in England. If you're born in the English colonies, that's, you know, no matter if you're in Virginia, or no matter if you're in Boston, or even down in Georgia, you are a citizen, and you are subject to English, to common law, right? Now, the Constitution of England, even today, does not exist. There is no, you know, the United States has a constitution, and it's pretty much been the same thing with a couple of changes, you know, over the last 250 years. 230 years, sorry. The English, there is no written constitution. It's just old traditions, and, you know, they write stuff down and they forget about it. It's kind of a mess. But one of the things that is emphasized is this idea of liberty. Now, let's talk about this idea of freedom and liberty, because here's the thing: is that it varies from person to person. Let me ask, what's your name? Brianna. Give me your definition, not the one that you expect me to hear, but your definition of what freedom is.
Like having a choice and being able to do what you want.
In regard to what?
I don't know, like your own life decisions.
Okay. No, listen, and there's no wrong answer to this, because I'm asking about your specific opinion. What about you, sir? What's your name?
Alana?
What's your definition of freedom?
Yeah, basically, waking up with the ability to do whatever you want.
Okay. Anyone else? Anyone have a definition of freedom that they want to share? Yes, sir.
So you wake up, have the choice, but with specific set of rules in place.
And that's very interesting, because, you know, a lot of people. I'm sure if I was to ask you, what about you, sir? What's your definition of freedom?
Do whatever you want.
Do whatever you want, right? But here's the thing: is that you put it with an asterisk, with certain laws in place. What do you mean by that?
So basically, yeah, you can do whatever you want, but you can't, let's say, go rob a store or kill someone, or else you go to jail. There's a certain limit to what choice you have, what choice you don't have.
Very good, because again, y'all forgot to put the asterisk in, or maybe you did forget to put the asterisk. In other words, I can't get up and say, you know what, this would be a good day. You know, that my neighbor down the street really, you know, the decorations he has in his front lawn really annoy me. I'm gonna go burn down his house. Today's a good day to do that. Can't really do that, right? Why?
Go to jail.
Yes, I'll go to jail. So here's the thing: is that, and even then, so here's the thing: is that we have to recognize that we live in a society. And here's the thing: is that we don't think about it a lot, but we live in a society where we are limited in the choices that we make, you know, because they may hurt others. Now here's the question, and it's a question that we've been struggling with for a while: is that really freedom? Right? If we are sacrificing our freedom for the expense of others, is that really freedom nonetheless? And our concept of freedom is one that we base on our own experiences now. Like, for example, if you were to ask a slave working in a plantation, a rice plantation in Georgia, what freedom is, would they probably have the same definition of freedom that you all have? No. Because their idea of freedom is very different. And even then, if you were to go back and ask a white person in London what their idea of freedom is, they'll have something different than yours. Why? Because their idea of freedom is owning a farm of their own, owning a business of their own. All right, it has nothing to do with being able to do whatever you want to wake up in the morning or whatever. All right, it's freedom differs from person to person. It is much like, if y'all ever heard the phrase "beauty is in the eye of the beholder," all right, it's the exact same thing. All right, freedom is how you define it. Now, here's the thing: is that during this period in time, Europe, and by extension the colonies, are going through a period of time known as the Enlightenment. All right, and it's basically a rethinking of all these different ideas, including freedom. right? And you have, these different mindsets and these different theories about what it actually means to be free, et cetera, et cetera. And so you have, kind of this concept of whether it is, what is actually to be free. Now, probably one of the biggest proponents of this idea of liberty is a man named John Locke. Now, John Locke is alive during the English Revolution. Remember this English Civil War between the monarch and the Parliament? Now, he's on the side of Parliament, right? And he's writing during this period of time and begins talking about this idea of I guess what you would call liberty, right? Now, Locke believed that the government works best when it tries to interfere least with its citizens. All right, as long as the government should be there to basically enforce contracts, to handle legal disputes, to prevent crime. Right, these things are what John Locke is referring to. All right, but more than anything else, it's also there to essentially it recognizes certain individual liberties. Right, the idea that people are born with certain rights that they shouldn't be messed with. For example, the government shouldn't be allowed to just come in, knock on your door, and say, "Hey, we're taking your house now. Get out." Right, or "Hey, you look somewhat suspicious. Off to jail." So John Locke is the first one to kind of, well, not the first one, but really in this modern era, really emphasize this idea of individual liberty, which will come up again and again in society. But at the end of the day, right now, what I want you to keep in mind is this idea of what exactly we're talking about, this idea of individual liberty and what it means to a person, because, again, it means different things to different people. Now, the colonial society at this point in time is one that emphasizes in public participation, kind of. Now, what I mean by that is that the ownership of property or anything else is tied in with rights. If you own property, all right, now it could be a small farm, it could be a large estate, but if you own property, you are considered to be part of society, all right, part of you have an investment in the success of your country, because if your country succeeds, more than likely you're going to succeed. Right? And so when it comes to the actual participation within governance, within, I guess what you call the right to vote, now this process of voting, right, and you will see this again and again come up throughout the semester, is known as suffrage. All right? The right to vote equals suffrage. But again, at this point in time, there are requirements. Number one, the ownership of property. You have to own property in order to participate in this public sphere. Right? If you are a sharecropper, if you are a laborer somewhere, you do not technically count, and you're not allowed to vote. Now, gender, very specific to men. Women at this point in time do not have the right to vote. All right, so again, needless to say, this comes up again and again. And in many of these societies, you have to be a certain religion, particularly a form of Protestantism. If y'all recall, in Massachusetts, you had to be a member of the Congregationalist Church. You could not be an Anglican. You could certainly not be a Catholic. All right, and even then, all right, needless to say, you have restrictions on race. Now remember, originally, technically speaking, freed black men could engage in participation, could engage in vote. But over the course of the next, 50 or so odd years, starting from, let's say, the early 1600s, you begin to see more and more restrictive laws being passed prohibiting free black men from voting. Needless to say, those also include Native Americans as well. Even those Native Americans who assimilated into society were oftentimes left out of voting rolls. Now, even if you own a small lot of land and you could engage in voting, you still couldn't run for public office because there is a tier. Right? You could only, in order to run for office, whether it's the local mayor or even the governor, you had to own even more land. All right, so most people were not involved in the actual process of holding political office. That usually was reserved for the more wealthy landowners of the society. Now, the idea behind this is that if an individual owns a large lot of land, they're clearly very smart. So therefore, we really want the smartest and the best and brightest in society to run for public office. We don't want some dummy as governor or mayor. So does it make sense? In other words, at the time there's an equation between owning large tracts of land and being intelligent. Now you ask yourself, well, what if you inherit the property? Well, there are exceptions. But nonetheless, all right, the idea is the more land you own, the more intelligent you are. Ish. Now, the colonial government itself, all right, every colony is different. They have their own set of laws. They run themselves in different ways, et cetera, et cetera. But at the end of the day, what is in common is the English attitude towards the colonies. Up until the 1760s, the colonies ran on a policy of what we call salutary neglect. And that basically means the English, for the most part, didn't really want anything to do with the colonies. They were fine with the colonies running themselves. Behave, don't cause us any problems, and just leave us alone. So for the most part, the colonies were used to running themselves, all right, which is very, very different from, say, for example, what's going on in France, and New France, what is now Canada, or even down in Spain. All right, these colonies are being micromanaged back home in Europe. England really isn't interested in managing that because it costs money. So they send a royal governor, but the governor isn't even paid by them. All right, so for the most part, the colonies pretty much manage themselves, which is important later on. All right, because when we talk about post-independence and the desire to create a government, most of the people who begin functioning this new American government will already have years of experience running their own affairs. All right? Now, here's the thing, is that at the heart of colonial governance is the assemblies. Each of the colonies has its own legislative assembly, it's its own government, right? And with elected representatives who pretty much manage their own affairs. Now, most of these same colonies have to deal with royal governors, right? Representatives of the king here in the Americas. Now, for the most part, they get along, but sometimes there are problems. All right, the governors try to enforce too many of these laws or ignore them, and it often causes tension between the assemblies and the governors. Now, the assemblies do have one, I guess what you would call one up on the governors, is that the assemblies are responsible for paying the governors. So if the governor is being a jerk, he doesn't want to play ball, and is being difficult, the assembly can just vote not to pay the governor. So this right, this system of the assembly in charge of the governor's salary makes sure that the governor, for the most part, plays ball. Right, but again, sometimes tensions rise and problems happen. Now, for the most part, many Americans were active in colonial assemblies and colonial politics. They would form clubs. They would meet at taverns to discuss the local political situation. They were very active in the political scene. Not to say that all, they were talking independence already. Independence won't, the talk of independence won't come up until well into the 1760s, right? But nonetheless, right, they were incredibly active, and they tried to maintain their activity not only through discussions of clubs and finding people who are similar and want to discuss and have the same interest, but also even those of the press. Journalism, newspapers, whatever media, whatever you want to call it, are incredibly important in this foundation of this upcoming American representative government. So an example of this is that of the colonial press. Now remember, to give them credit, the Puritans and the government that they established in the Northeast created a culture of literacy. All right, because why? Because Puritans, the Congregationalists, more than anyone else, emphasize literacy. All right, you have to read the Bible, know how to read. And so this tradition of literacy, all right, and they even created a public school system for this exact purpose. So the promulgation of literacy, the literacy rate in the colonies was much more higher than it was in England. And so, because of this, you have a good, I guess what you would call market for magazines, for newspapers, etc., etc. As a matter of fact, the famous Ben Franklin, that of American history, created the first printing press here in the colonies for the purpose of establishing or the purpose of creating a newspaper. So, from even in the early 1700s, you begin to see more and more popularity of these newspapers. Now, however, it does not necessarily mean that newspapers can publish whatever they want. The newspapers were censored, they were destroyed, even some of the publishers were actually arrested. So you do have censorship. It does not complete and total freedom of the press. Now, what I'm kind of go on to this is that, remember, freedom of speech is a relatively new idea. Now, I'll ask you the same thing. What does freedom of speech mean? The ability to say whatever you want. Okay, so let me just say this. Does that mean that you can just get up here in front of the class and just talk over me and just, whatever?
Technically, yes. Yeah.
Well, here's the thing, though, is that I'm sure you can do that, but will there be consequences? Yeah. But how, though? And is my freedom of speech infringing on your freedom of speech? We're getting deep into philosophy now, right? It sucks. Well, here's the thing, is that we'll talk more about this when we talk about the amendments. And I promise you, we'll get a lot into the amendments. And because you should know them. All right, whether you are just talking about the typical First Amendment, Second Amendment, or even when it comes to the rights of the accused. All right, the Fifth, Sixth, Seventh Amendments, especially when it comes to your rights if you're being accused of a crime, very important to know. But nonetheless, all right, so let's say scenario that, Brianna, right? Brianna, you come up here and you push me aside and you start talking about something entirely different. All right, can you do that? No, the answer is we can't. I mean, in theory, you can, just like you can steal my car, but not a good idea. So here's the thing, is that while you have this freedom of expression, freedom of speech, it is not completely absolute. In other words, if you say something horribly offensive to me, there's nothing stopping me from telling you need to be quiet. And I promise you, I'm not going to tell you need to be quiet. It's going to be, shut up. The point I'm trying to make in my garbled thing is that the freedom of expression concept is often times convoluted, where you can say whatever you want, whenever you want, and that's not really the case. I mean, you all have common sense, right? Can you yell bomb at an airport? Don't ever do that. Okay. No, the answer is please, for the love of God. That I want to hear resounding no. Do not yell bomb at an airport. You'll never see any of us again. All right. Same thing. Can you yell fire at a crowded theater? No. No. The answer is no. Please don't do that either. So there are limitations to the freedom of expression. The limitations to the freedom of speech. Yes, you can get up here and say whatever it is you want and push me out of the way, but there's nothing else stopping me from basically saying you're being disruptive to the class and I'm going to drop you. All right, so what we're talking about here is freedom of speech from the government. Can you come up here and say, or can you go anywhere, a public place, and say, the governor of this colony is an idiot? Technically speaking, at this point in time, no, probably not. Right, so there are limitations just like there are today, at the time there are, and they're much more restrictive at the time. Now I'll give you an example. John Zenger is a publisher of a newspaper in New York, and he publishes an article about the corruption of the governor at the time, the governor of New York, the royal governor of New York. Right, and here's the thing: is that all the stuff that he's publishing is true. All right, but the governor nonetheless doesn't appreciate it and orders Enger's arrest for sedition. It's basically treason. So he goes on trial. This is 1735, and the judge pretty much says, "Okay, what exactly are we here for?" Well, he's saying all these things about me, and he's slandering me, and he's clearly a criminal. And so the judge asks a simple question: is anything he's saying false? The governor goes, no, but still, it hurt my feelings. Right? And so the judge says, well, there's nothing I can do. He's not saying anything incorrect. He's not lying. So, as far as I'm concerned, he didn't do anything wrong. So the trial of John Zenger is important because it does establish this concept of freedom of the press, which ties into this freedom of expression, where, you're not, yes, if you lie about someone, all right, and that causes them distress financially or otherwise, yes, you can be held accountable. But if you are just saying things that are true that may hurt the feelings of someone else, as long as you can prove it, you're fine. Right? There's nothing really a government can do to silence you. Now, again, as I mentioned before, this period in time that we're going through right now is enlightenment, and it covers a lot of things, everything from science to medicine to politics to religion. Back in Europe, there are many people who begin promoting this idea of deism. Now, deism is a very simple philosophy. So it's a question of, if God is good, if God is inherently good and righteous and all-knowing, all-powerful, why do bad things happen? Why are there famines? Why is there war? Why are there earthquakes? Now, these questions have plagued philosophers and theologians forever. All right, and they have different reasons for it. God is angry. God is upset. Et cetera, et cetera. But again, it ties into the fact that, remember, in many Christian churches at this point in time, there is a belief that God is good. So how can God be good if God is constantly trying to kill us all? So, an answer to this, all right, in the minds of many philosophers at the time, is that God is neither good nor evil. God is just there. So according to deists, God created the heavens and the earth, created man, and pretty much has went on break. And he hasn't come back since. So God, think of it like, you all see those old grandfather clocks, the ones with the pendulum? So the premise is, as soon as you start the pendulum, it will keep swinging, and it won't stop. And so in many ways, God is God created the universe like that. Just kind of spun it, and it never stops spinning. And everything that happens now, war, disease, earthquakes, tornadoes, etc., just again, it's just the natural order of things. It's just the way it happens. All right, God is neither punishing us nor is He blessing us. It is just life. And so many deists, again, or many of the intellectual elite, begin adopting this concept of this what we call a passive deity. All right, and it became very popular among many circles, especially among the learned academic elite here in the American colonies. Now, as I mentioned, the Enlightenment focuses a lot on trying to find natural reactions or natural responses to things. Maybe tornadoes happen because of natural phenomena, not because God is angry. Maybe people drop dead of heart attacks, not because they angered God, but because there's maybe a medical condition for this. So all of a sudden now there is this increase of what we call, if you recall from our previous lecture, secularization. This attempt to try to find logical, rational reasons for what were used to be just, God did it, or God is the reason. So, not only this, but this all of a sudden now you have church attendance in decline. You have less people claiming religious affiliation. You have more people embracing enlightened secularist ideals, and so to many people this was simply unacceptable. And you begin to see preachers and pastors begin openly rejecting these things. Now this process of rejection of these enlightened principles, especially that of secularization, the separation of religion from the people, is the foundation of what becomes the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening, again, is this use of new methods of preaching the gospel that were really not done before. Now, the thing I'm talking about the most that I want you to keep in mind is the word emotionalism. Right now, emotionalism is the use of emotion, singing, dancing, crying, trying to get people involved in church services. All right, pastors. Well, I'll give you an example. When I was a kid, there were a lot of what we call televangelists on television. I don't know if maybe some of you are too young to remember, but these guys would go on TV on Saturday mornings, Sunday mornings, and would claim to be, possessed by the Holy Spirit. They would speak in tongues, and they would dance, and they would move wildly around. My favorite thing is the faith healing, all right, where there's this little old lady with arthritis would come up to the stage, and the preacher would put his hand on her and say, "In the name of Jesus, I heal you," and would slap her across the face. And all of a sudden, her arthritis is cured. All right, so these very animated, that's what we call emotionalism, this use of emotion in society. All right, which is, again, very different from what's going on in most of the Anglican, Catholic, Lutheran traditions, very much not like that. You don't see a lot of emotion in preaching or in Catholicism or in Lutheranism. All right, so you begin to see this new kind of experimentation with the use of emotion. Not only that, but you also see individuals like Jonathan Edwards, one of the main religious figures within the Enlightenment, not only emphasizing emotion, but emphasizing what we call fire and brimstone. All right, his favorite sermon, "Sinners in the Hands of Angry God," all right, warns us that God is angry, God is wrathful, God is vengeful, and if you do not, follow the word of Christ, if you do not follow my word, you will be sent into the brimstone and fire of hell. Preachers like him spend a lot of time talking about damnation, talking about eternal hellfire. All right, again, this is on purpose, trying to scare people, more than anything else, into believing the word of Christ. And you know what? It works. All of a sudden, Whitefield and others, they begin traveling throughout the colonies, holding these massive outdoor revivals. All right, and all of a sudden, thousands attend, tens of thousands attend. People worried about their souls in the afterlife. Now, another important individual, aside from Jonathan Edwards, is this man, George Whitefield, who's here, by the way. George Whitefield, again, is actually born in Scotland, but comes to the Americas, and again, same thing, begins preaching this concept of fire and brimstone and eternal damnation. Now, more than anything else, George Whitefield represents this kind of split within American Protestantism, which we refer to today as the old lights versus the new lights. And so, even those in Protestant churches who thought emotionalism was, it was good, but there has to be limits. You begin to see a split between those who keep wanting to push the limits of emotionalism and those who think, it's enough. So the old lights are those who are more traditional, wanted to, yes, emotionalism is fine to an extent. All right, but then you have the new lights who just wanted to, crank it up to 11. All right, keep going. Let's see where this takes us. All right, so it's important that you all are know the distinction between the old lights, I guess what you call the old school, all right, emotionalism, a little goes a long way. And between the new lights, these revisionists who want to really emphasize this use of emotionalism. Now, so by the end of this Great Awakening, you have tens of thousands of people becoming revitalized in religion, wanting to emphasize this religion, wanting to kind of participate more and more. Now, the after effects of the Great Awakening by 1750 kind of vary. First thing is this issue of slavery. Now, the issue of slavery during these sermons rarely comes up, but nonetheless, all right, when it does, all right, it is emphasized not necessarily that slavery is a sin, but rather the fact that many slaves are not Christian is a sin. And so you have many plantation owners inviting these preachers to come in and baptize and prophesize to their slave populations. All right, so you begin seeing a massive increase in the amount of slaves actually practicing a form of Christianity. Not only that, you begin to see a system of new beliefs. Right? Methodists, what we now call Southern Baptists, come from this tradition of emotionalism. Right? The use of emotion, the use of fire and brimstone, the fear of eternal damnation is a part of this as well. Now, one of the after effects or side effects of this idea, of this Great Awakening, is what we now call today anti-intellectualism. Right? The idea that you know, the so-called scientists and doctors and academics, they don't really know what's going on. They're just a bunch of sinners. They're a bunch of liars. So it develops in the United States this tradition of anti-intellectualism, where anyone considered to be a nerd or a geek or whatever is often derided and quite frankly incorrect. Right? So it has long-lasting effects throughout not just the early United States history, but even in modern United States history. Now, remember, the other imperial colonies are. Oh, I thought you were going to push me out of the way and start talking to you. I was like, finally, it's going to happen. Now, the English colonies are not the only imperial power. If you all recall, the Spanish are still here, the French are still here, and even now you have a new player in the game by the mid-1700s. Now, the Spanish, all right, needless to say, have been around for a while in what we now, especially in the American Southwest and in Florida. But by the mid-1700s, there is a cause for concern. Not only are the French pushing further and further into this region, all of a sudden, a group of French explorers accidentally find themselves in the middle of Santa Fe, New Mexico, right, the colony. All of a sudden now you start to see French settlers arrive in what is now East Texas. All right, and not only that, all right, the few soldiers that are stationed in what we now call Northern California, Southern Oregon, are reporting that Russian explorers, fur trappers, and others have arrived in the region and are claiming it as well. So the Spanish all of a sudden begin panicking that they're at risk of losing their northern colonial possessions. And so they begin emphasizing or re-emphasizing the colonization efforts in their northern provinces, particularly that of California and of Texas. Now, in both regions, you have the increase in building of both missions and presidios. A mission is one specifically for the promulgation of Catholicism. All right, for example, in California, in 1769, the Franciscan missionary Junipero Serra is ordered to travel to California and build a series of missions to convert the local natives to Catholicism, right, which he does to some pretty devastating effects. The population of the Native American population in California, for the most part, was nomadic. They kind of traveled from place to place, and they had a fairly, common typical lifestyle. When the Spanish arrived, they forced the local native population, which again used to be nomadic, into settlements. Converted them, forced them to work in these missions. Many of them ended up dying of disease. It drastically reduced the size of the population in the Americas, or at least in California, I should say. Now, aside from that, you also have the construction of presidios. These are strictly military positions, all right, fortresses designed to protect certain locations and sites. An example of this is here in San Francisco, in Monterrey, and here in San Antonio.
Should we claim that upper part, right next to California? Doesn't really line up.
I'm sorry?
Who claimed that?
Here,
Yeah.
that is the Russians. All right, the Russians, by this point in time, had already pushed out of Alaska. They began colonizing Alaska, and you begin to see Russian raiding parties, or fur trappers, pushing into what is now Oregon and Washington. So this is what the Spanish are freaked out about. Right? Not only do you have the French pushing further and further into Texas, we also now all of a sudden have the Russians pushing into these regions as well. Now, again, the French, as much as they expand, as further and further into this region as they expand, it's important to note that the French only number about 30,000 people by 1760. Compare that to the colonies here of England, which number about 3 million. So as much territory as the French are claiming, they simply do not have the numbers to actually do anything about it, right? Most of the population is focused here in Quebec, all right? Again, far from any type of other influence beyond that. Now, last slide, or ish, I hope. I don't know, completely overwhelmed me, yes. So, with these imperial powers, specifically France and England, pushing over the same territory, it's inevitable that war is going to happen. Now, the area that I'm referring to specifically is this region here. This is the Ohio River Valley. It is kind of the frontier region between French North America and English North America. And both sides are starting to build settlements and fortresses along the region, claiming them for themselves. So with all this buildup, with soldiers and settlers being pushed into this region, it's only a matter of time before you begin to see problems happening. And inevitably, it happens. Actually, believe it or not, George Washington, who at the time is a very young man, a colonel in the Virginia militia, accidentally starts a world war. How many actually knew that? That George Washington started a world war? No? So here's what happened. George Washington is given orders that to investigate a possible French fortress being built here in this region here. All right. He's sent to investigate, and again, his only job is to observe and report. Take about 150 men with you, look for this fort if it exists, and report back to us. So he takes his men, and sure enough, after a few days of searching, he finds a French fort. Right. Now, at the time, it seems like this fort is relatively underpopulated. It seems like there's only about 10 or 15 guys protecting it. And so he decides, to take advantage of the situation, make himself look good, and actually attack the fort. What he doesn't know is that, yes, there are only about 20 French soldiers defending the fort, but there are about 250 Algonquins camped inside the fort. They're just passing by and they just needed a place to stay. The Algonquins are allied with the French. And so when George Washington attacks, he attacks he attacks a fort defended by 300 defenders. So not only does his attack fail, he is forced to surrender. The French commander kind of is embarrassed for him and says, just take your men and get out. This is very embarrassing for him. And he pretty much tells him, just lay down your weapons and go home. There was enough punishment already. So when the word gets back that the Virginia militia had attacked the French fort back to France, the French used it as a pretext to declare war. So, through his own ego and stupidity, George Washington accidentally started a world war, because this is not only a war that takes place in North America, it actually happens here in England, off the coast of Africa, South America, and even in India. This is truly a world war, all started by George Washington. I tell this to my classes, and they're kind of like, what? Go ahead.
Also naval warfare in the North Atlantic.
Absolutely. So it is truly a world war. Right? So, obviously we refer to the World War as in 1914, but truly this was, again, a world war started by George Washington. Now, here in the Americas, pretty much anywhere else outside of the Americas, we refer to this as the 7 Years' War, all right, for obvious reasons. But here it is often also known as the French and Indian War. Now, most of this war will be fought in North America, will be fought between the colonists and their Algonquin allies, and among others. Remember, the French, over the last 200 or so years, had developed pretty strong alliances with several important Native American confederations. And so, this is really a war, at least in North America, fought by the colonists. Now, at first, it does not go well. The colonists are not very well organized. The Native Americans, they're fighting on their own territory, and they're very numerous. And so it doesn't really go well. However, over the course of time, the English begin adjusting to certain tactics. They begin sending more supplies. They begin arming them. They begin training them more professionally. And eventually, the colonists are able to not only succeed in repelling the attacks of the Native Americans, they also begin the process of actually marching up to Quebec, the capital of French Canada, and capturing it. So, it's a pretty successful war overall. And at the end of it, the treaty that ends the war in 1763 gives the entirety of North America to either the English or the Spanish. Basically how this works is that the English now claim everything east of this, of the Mississippi River. This is Mississippi River. So the English now claim everything east of this, including Canada, and the Spanish claim everything west of it. So the French in North America are no more. Funny enough, so New Orleans here has a very, very distinct French culture. You know, the Cajuns, right? Interesting enough, that only happens after this war. So the island here, the island here, which is now Prince Edward Island, used to be called Acadia, and it was another large settlement of French settlers. When the English took over, well, actually the British by this point in time, when the British took over, they pretty much decided, yeah, we don't want all these French people hanging around, so they boarded them up to ships and sent them to New Orleans. All right, and that is why they are there today. That is why their descendants are still there today. All right, they originally weren't there. They originally settled here in Canada until the British kicked them out. It's an interesting little tidbit. Now, this war causes way more problems than it solved. All right, first of all, with all of a sudden now, with all the English now claiming this huge swath of land west of the Appalachians, the English colonists, the American colonists here are excited. We have all this land now that we're going to settle, and you know we're going to move in, and things are going to be great. There's a problem though, is that yes, the French are out, but there's still a ton of Native Americans along this area. And as they begin settling in, it eventually upsets one of the major political power players within the Native American society, Pontiac. Actually leads a rebellion, a war against these new American settlers. Right? Now, eventually the war is settled, but the English government do not want any more problems with the Native Americans. And so, they tell and warn the Native American, or the English settlers, you cannot move beyond this line. The King of England establishes what is known as the Proclamation Line in 1763. Basically what it means is that colonists are banned from moving west of this line. Right? They have to stay within this line here. There's a problem though. There's no way to enforce it. There's no customs or border patrol or anything else like that. And so English colonists for the most part ignore it. Still, the fact that the king is trying to prohibit them from moving into land that they want. Remember, as far as the colonists are concerned, we won this war. Right? So the fact that they're being denied this reward, it's kind of irritating. Kind of really irritating. Now, not only that, you begin to see a sense of crisis. The English had spent a lot of money fighting and winning this war, to the point where by 1763, the British are broke. They're financially really in bad straits. And so, all of a sudden now, there is a desire to increase revenue for the English. And one of the big ways that they decide to increase revenue, the colonies. All right, it's time, they haven't really been paying any taxes to us. Most of the taxes that they pay go to their colonial assemblies and the colonial governments. It's time that they pay their share. Now, and so, the Native Americans, again, who even after Pontiac, all of a sudden find themselves at this crossroads, have to make a decision. Do we stay? Do we leave? Do we fight? What do we do? And so you begin to see many Native Americans here really, really find themselves in a nervous position because all of a sudden the American colonists are not paying attention to their government. All right, you begin to see more and more of them pouring into this valley that I was referring to here. All right, which means to say is going to cause problems. And so, all right, this is where we'll end this particular lecture at the eve of some pretty big crossroads, right, where the American colonists have now a sense of identity, a sense of pride, that they had defeated the French, their Algonquin allies, and they have claimed North America for themselves. But all of a sudden now their biggest obstacle is not the Native Americans, it is not some foreign power, it is their own government. All right, and we'll see how this plays out starting next week. All right, y'all. Very quickly, again, a reminder that your exam opens up on Friday. Please make sure you have that done before the deadline on Sunday at 9 p.m. All right, don't forget, you also have other assignments beyond this as well. Make sure you do those in addition. Next Tuesday, we'll come back, we'll start with chapter, we'll talk about the regulatory warrant, go from there. Let me quickly get attendance, and I'll send you on your